Most people believe the One Piece is the most dangerous treasure in the world, that once it's found, the balance of power will finally collapse, the truth of history will be exposed, and the world will be forced to change. But that assumption might already be wrong. Because hidden beneath the surface of the story, buried even deeper than Laughtale, there are signs that something else has been shaping the world for far longer. Something older, quieter, and far more terrifying to the people who truly rule. A treasure that doesn't promise freedom, but threatens authority itself. A treasure so symbolic that its existence alone could invalidate 800 years of control. This is the kind of object that doesn't need to be used to be dangerous. Just being recognized is enough, and what makes it even more unsettling is the trail it leaves behind. The same handful of names keep circling it like ghosts. Gol D, Roger, Shanks, Buggy, Monkey D, Garp, and eventually Luffy. Men who shouldn't all be connected by coincidence, yet somehow always are. The story never announces this treasure, it never names it clearly. But its shadow keeps appearing at the worst possible moments, as if the world itself is trying to remember something it was forced to forget. What's strange is how casually this object seems to move through history, never staying in one place for long, never drawing attention to itself, yet always ending up in the hands of people who stand at turning points in the world. Roger didn't just conquer the seas. He encountered something that made him laugh, hesitate, and ultimately surrender himself. Shanks didn't just rise to Yonko status. He was protected, spared, and granted audiences no pirate should ever receive. Buggy, the man who fails upward, keeps tripping over symbols of authority he doesn't understand, yet somehow survives every era that should have crushed him. Garp, the so-called hero of the Marines, stands as the only man who could oppose monsters without ever bowing to the throne. And Luffy, who doesn't chase crowns or titles, keeps inheriting the weight of them anyway. None of these people behave like traditional rulers, yet the world bends around them as if responding to something unseen. As if they're orbiting a symbol that predates piracy, predates the world government, and predates the lie that power must sit on a throne. And that's where the world government's fear begins. Because their control has never been built on raw strength alone. It's been built on symbols, flags, titles, empty thrones, erased names. The illusion that authority flows in only one direction. But what if that illusion has always been fragile? What if there exists a symbol so old, so universally recognized by the sea itself, that it renders their authority meaningless the moment it's acknowledged? For decades, the world government has chased devil fruits, hunted bloodlines, erased islands, and executed men who laughed too freely. But what if they've been chasing the wrong threat the entire time? Not a man, not a family, not even an ancient weapon, but a crown. Not a literal object to be worn, but a concept, pirate sovereignty, a reminder that the seas once answered to no throne at all. Their panic doesn't come from what pirates do. It comes from what pirates represent. And if that symbol were ever recognized again, if the world remembered who once held it, the world government wouldn't just lose control. They would lose legitimacy. But here's the part that changes everything. The trail of this treasure doesn't start with Luffy. It doesn't even start with Roger. The first real clue appears at a moment the world was told never to question. God Valley. A vanished island. A forbidden name. A battle reduced to a footnote. Everyone remembers the clash. The Marines versus the Rock's pirates. Garp the hero. Roger the rival. But almost no one asks why it happened there, or what was present that required both sides to show up at once. And even fewer notice what quietly disappears from the record afterward. Because somewhere in that chaos, something was taken, something was hidden, and something was possibly switched. A crown that vanished without a trace. A symbol powerful enough that even now, decades later, the world is still reorganizing itself around its absence. And once you start following that missing crown instead of the loud legends, the entire story of One Piece begins to shift. Slowly at first, then all at once. There's a strange pattern in One Piece that almost no one talks about, even though it keeps surfacing at critical moments. A legend that's referenced without a name, acknowledged without explanation, and then immediately buried beneath louder events. It's not the One Piece itself, not an ancient weapon, and not a devil fruit. Instead, it exists in the background, hinted at through crowns, treasure chests, inheritance, and the way certain pirates are treated differently by the world. The story never pauses to explain it outright, which is exactly why it's so easy to miss. Yet every time the world order teeters on the edge, this legend quietly reappears. Pirates speak of treasures greater than gold. Marines whisper about symbols that should never resurface. Even the world government reacts not with open force, but with panic and erasure whenever these hints align. This isn't accidental. Oda has layered something into the narrative that behaves like a memory the world itself is trying to suppress. And when you trace those hints backward, they don't lead to a place. They lead to a status, a forgotten idea of what it once meant to rule the seas without permission. What makes this legend unsettling is how casually it's referenced by people who should never agree on anything. Pirates from different eras speak of certain treasures as if they carry weight beyond value. Not power that can be spent, but power that recognizes its holder. Captain John's treasure is the clearest example, treated less like loot and more like a legacy, something that survived its owner and continued to matter long after his death. Buggy's obsession with it isn't greed alone, it's instinct. The same kind that's guided him into impossible survival time and time again. Even Roger's crew treats certain chests and heirlooms with a reverence that feels out of place for men who laughed at the world. These references never come with exposition. No one ever says why they matter, but the reactions tell the story. The moment these treasures surface, alliances shift, Marines hesitate, and history starts closing in. It's as if the world remembers something before the characters do. And that's because this legend was never about wealth in the first place. Gold doesn't scare the world government. Neither do pirates getting rich. What they fear is legitimacy. The idea that the seas once recognized authority without crowns sanctioned by gods or thrones protected by walls. The pirate crown jewel, unnamed, unconfirmed but persistently present, represents that lost sovereignty. Not a king of pirates in title, but a pirate acknowledged by the world itself. Someone who didn't need permission to rule because the sea answered to them naturally. This is why the symbol keeps appearing near characters who reject hierarchy without even realizing it. Roger laughed instead of ruling. Shanks protects balance without claiming power. Luffy refuses authority while drawing it toward himself anyway. Even Buggy, who craves status, becomes a walking parody of it, crowned by mistake yet followed by thousands. The jewel doesn't care about intent. It responds to presence, to will, to the kind of gravity that pulls others in. And that makes it far more dangerous than any weapon. Because weapons can be destroyed. Symbols can't. And when symbols vanish, history bleeds. That's why the disappearance of the pirate crown jewel doesn't line up with a quiet era. It aligns with one of the most violent erasures in the story. God Valley wasn't just a battle. It was a massacre scrubbed from the record so thoroughly that even its location no longer exists. An island wiped away, a name forbidden, an event reduced to rumor. And in the aftermath, something else is missing. A symbol that never resurfaces, yet leaves its fingerprints everywhere. The timing isn't a coincidence. You don't erase an island unless something there threatens the foundation of your rule. You don't silence an entire era unless a symbol existed that people could rally behind. And you don't let that symbol reappear. Not ever. Which raises the real question the story keeps avoiding. If the pirate crown jewel vanished at God Valley, who took it? Who hid it? And why has the world been quietly reshaping itself ever since, to make sure no one recognizes it again? This is where Rox D. Xebec re-enters the picture, not as the main villain, but as the catalyst. Xebec wasn't just violent or ambitious. He was disruptive. He didn't want to rule the world. He wanted to tear down the idea that it could be ruled at all. That ideology alone would have made him dangerous, but it wouldn't justify erasing an island from history. What would justify that kind of response is access, knowledge, or possession. If something of immense symbolic value was present at God Valley and Rox discovered it, the entire balance would have shattered. Suddenly, the celestial dragons aren't spectators anymore. They're targets. The Marines aren't enforcing law. They're panicking. And Roger isn't a rival pirate. He's a variable that must be controlled. In that light, the alliance makes sense. Stop Rox, secure the object, bury the truth, and rewrite the story. Not because Rox was too strong, but because he got too close to something the world was never meant to remember. And here's the detail that ties everything together. If God Valley was about retrieval, then the most important action wouldn't have happened during the battle. It would have happened before it. Treasures don't wait patiently while wars rage around them. They're moved, hidden, switched, especially if the people guarding them realize too late that they're about to lose control, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. By the time Roger and Garp arrived, the thing everyone was fighting over may have already been gone, replaced with something ordinary, left behind as bait while the real prize disappeared into chaos. That would explain why the world government's response afterward feels misaligned. Why do their punishments target the wrong people? Why their fear seems focused on symbols rather than individuals? Because if the priceless treasure of God Valley was switched before the battle ever reached its peak, then the war everyone remembers wasn't the climax at all. It was a distraction, and the real turning point happened quietly, inside a treasure chest that no one thought to question. Captain John's treasure is one of those details. One Piece drops into the story and then refuses to explain, even though it clearly matters. He wasn't just another pirate lost to history. He was part of Rock's crew, surrounded by monsters. Yet his legacy survives not through strength or fame, but through a single unresolved obsession. A treasure so significant that it outlived him, so elusive that it fractured loyalties, and so important that even decades later, pirates still chase rumors of its location. But what's always felt off isn't that the treasure exists. It's how it's treated. No one ever describes what it actually is. Not gold, not weapons, not maps. Just Captain John's treasure, spoken like a placeholder for something too dangerous to name. Even the way it's handled is strange. His corpse is desecrated not out of hatred, but desperation. His crew tears itself apart searching for something they believe was stolen. And when the treasure is finally referenced again, it's not found in a vault or a fortress. It's reduced to a clue, a locator. As if the real object was never meant to be recovered directly, only tracked. That alone suggests the treasure wasn't meant to be spent or claimed. It was meant to be recognized. That recognition becomes terrifying once you consider the timing. Captain John dies after God Valley. His treasure goes missing after God Valley. And one small red-haired child appears in Roger's life shortly after God Valley, discovered not in a royal hall or pirate den, but inside a treasure chest. That detail is often played for humor, yet it shouldn't be. Roger's crew weren't careless scavengers. They didn't open random chests without suspicion, especially in the aftermath of the most dangerous incident in the world. The idea that a baby would be found hidden in a chest at exactly that moment, then quietly raised among pirates who would later shape the entire era, is not coincidence. It's concealment. The theory that Baby Shanks was swapped with the pirate crown jewel reframes everything. If Roger's crew realized that the symbol everyone was hunting couldn't be destroyed, the only option left would be misdirection. Hide the real treasure in the most unassuming form possible. And what could be more invisible than a child? No markings, no aura. No reason for the world government to suspect the truth had already slipped through their fingers. This also explains why Roger's crew would choose to hide something so important in plain sight rather than lock it away. Locking it up would only confirm its value. Hiding it would invite pursuit. But embedding it into the flow of history itself? That's something else entirely. Roger understood the world was sick. He knew history was being manipulated, not just erased. So instead of hoarding the symbol of pirate sovereignty, he let it move freely, untouched by authority, growing naturally alongside the era that would one day challenge the throne. That decision fits Roger perfectly. He didn't want to rule. He wanted the world to arrive at the truth on its own. And Shanks, whether he was the treasure itself or merely its vessel, was raised with that philosophy. Never claiming power, never seeking dominance, only appearing when balance is at risk. That's not the behavior of a man chasing a throne. It's the behavior of someone protecting a symbol until the world is ready to recognize it again. And this is where the world government's greatest failure reveals itself. If the crown jewel was swapped during God Valley, then everything that followed was built on a false assumption. The executions, the surveillance, the bloodline purges, the obsessive fear of certain names. They thought they knew where the danger was, so they chased the wrong shadow for decades. They watched Shanks closely, but never moved against him decisively. They tolerated Buggy as a joke. They underestimated Luffy as a wild card. All because the symbol they feared no longer looked like a treasure. It looked like history continuing as usual. And that mistake was never corrected because admitting it would mean admitting the truth slipped through their grasp during the one moment they believed they had absolute control. A crown was taken from under their noses, replaced with a child in a chest, and the world was never the same again. Once you accept the possibility that the pirate crown jewel was switched at God Valley, the world government's behavior across the next several decades suddenly stops looking random and starts looking desperate. Because from their perspective, they didn't lose the treasure. They identified it, or at least, they thought they did. A red-haired child appears immediately after the incident, raised by the pirate king himself, present on the ship that reached the end of the world. To the people who rule through symbols, this would have been enough. They didn't need proof. They didn't need confirmation. All they needed was a narrative that made sense to them. The crown jewel had vanished, but the vessel remained. Shanks wasn't just Roger's apprentice in their eyes. He was the thing Roger stole from God Valley, growing up right in front of them. That belief would explain why Shanks was watched, but never eliminated, monitored, but never erased. You don't destroy a symbol if you think doing so might trigger something worse. You isolate it. You contain it. You wait. That misunderstanding also casts Roger's execution in a far darker light. Officially, Roger was executed to end the pirate era, to send a message, to prove that no one, not even the Pirate King, stood above the law. But that explanation collapses the moment Roger smiles and starts the Great Pirate Era instead. The execution didn't stop piracy. It ignited it. which means its true purpose had nothing to do with deterrence. Roger wasn't killed because he was dangerous in the present. He was killed because of what he had already done. The world government believed Roger had taken the crown jewel, hidden it, and passed it on. His execution wasn't justice. It was punishment for a theft they could never publicly acknowledge. They couldn't say what he stole. They couldn't admit it existed. So they settled for spectacle. Kill the man, scare the world. Hope the symbol fades with him. Except it didn't. Roger died laughing, confident that whatever he had set in motion no longer belonged to him. And the world government never realized how badly they had misread that moment. Shanks's protected status only deepens this miscalculation. No pirate in history has been treated the way Shanks has. He walks into Marineford and ends a war with a sentence. He meets the Gorosei in secret and leaves untouched. His crew sails freely through territories where others would be annihilated. This has never made sense if Shanks is just a Yonko, but it makes perfect sense if the world government believes he is the crown jewel, or at least the closest thing to it they can identify. Killing Shanks would be like smashing a sacred relic without understanding how it works. If the jewel responds to will or lineage or recognition, then destroying the wrong vessel could awaken something uncontrollable. So they choose restraint, surveillance, negotiation, quiet fear. Shanks becomes a walking paradox, a pirate the world government tolerates, not because he serves them, but because they're terrified of what happens if they act. And yet, destiny never respects containment. The greatest irony of the world government's mistake is that while they focused on Shanks, the real inheritance was already moving elsewhere. Because Shanks never claimed power, never sought the throne, never wore the crown they feared. Instead, he stood at the crossroads of history, waiting, watching. And when the time came, he placed his hat on a boy who didn't even know what a crown was. Luffy wasn't meant to be a king. He was meant to be a catalyst. The world government spent decades watching the wrong man, guarding the wrong symbol, and chasing the wrong king. And by the time they realized the mistake, destiny had already moved on, quietly, carelessly, and completely out of their control. Luffy taking Captain John's treasure finder is one of those moments that feels insignificant on the surface, almost comedic, until you step back and realize how rarely Luffy does anything without meaning. He doesn't collect artifacts. He doesn't hoard relics. He barely even understands the value of treasure in the first place. Gold bores him. Power structures confuse him. Titles mean nothing. And yet, out of everything he could have ignored or thrown aside, he keeps the one object explicitly designed to find a treasure no one can explain. Not because he wants what it leads to, but because something about it feels right to him. Luffy doesn't reason his way into destiny. He stumbles into it. He moves by instinct, guided by a sense of rightness that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with alignment. The treasure finder doesn't make him stronger. It doesn't give him answers. It simply stays with him, quietly acknowledging that wherever Luffy goes, the world's missing symbol is already closer to being found. That's not a coincidence. That's fate recognizing itself. What makes this more unsettling is how naturally authority bends around Luffy, even when he actively rejects it. Crews follow him without contracts. Kingdoms trust him without treaties. Enemies hesitate not because he's the strongest man in the room, but because something about him feels inevitable. This is the same kind of authority ancient kings were believed to possess, not enforced but accepted. Pirate royalty was never about bloodlines or crowns passed down through families. It was about presence, the ability to stand at the center of chaos and have others instinctively align themselves around you. That symbolism has followed Luffy since the beginning. Straw hats, flags, drums, laughter, all echoes of an older language of leadership. The kind that doesn't demand obedience, but inspires it without effort. Luffy doesn't want to rule the seas, yet the seas respond to him anyway. That contradiction is exactly why the pirate crown jewel would recognize him, because it was never meant for someone who wanted power. It was meant for someone who embodied freedom so completely that power followed naturally. This is where the idea of bloodline inheritance finally breaks down. The world government obsesses over lineage because it's predictable. Blood can be tracked. Names can be erased, families can be wiped out, but will can't be contained. And the crown, whatever form it truly takes, doesn't respond to ancestry alone. It responds to resonance. That's why it moves so erratically through history. Roger wasn't born a king. Garp didn't claim one. Shanks refused it. Buggy stumbled into its shadow by accident, and Luffy never even notices it watching him. The crown responds to people who align with its core principle: absolute rejection of imposed authority. That's why Luffy's will breaks devil fruits, terrifies emperors, and destabilizes ancient systems without him ever intending to. He doesn't carry the crown because of who he comes from. He carries it because of who he refuses to become. And in a world built on control, that makes him the most dangerous presence imaginable. Which brings us to the uncomfortable realization that someone has been watching this pattern unfold long before Luffy ever set sail. Someone who understood that blood would fail, but will would persist. Someone who laughed at the idea of chosen heirs, yet trusted destiny enough to let it move on its own. Gol D. Roger knew the crown wouldn't respond to force. He knew hiding it behind walls or titles would only corrupt it. That's why he didn't pass it down the way the world government expected. He let it drift, let it observe, let it choose. And in doing so, he placed his faith not in a successor, but in the future itself. Roger didn't need to see the outcome. He only needed to know that when the time came, the crown would recognize the right person, not by name, not by blood, but by will. And one man, standing at the edge of history, may have understood this better than anyone else. Buggy has always been treated like a joke, And that's precisely why he's one of the most dangerous figures in the story. Not because he's powerful, but because he keeps surviving moments that should erase him completely. His obsession with Captain John's treasure has always been framed as greed, cowardice, or desperation, yet that reading misses something critical. Buggy doesn't chase treasure the way other pirates do. He doesn't calculate risk versus reward. He reacts instinctively, emotionally, almost reflexively. Every time Captain John's treasure comes up, Buggy's behavior changes. His fear sharpens. His attention narrows. It's less like a man chasing gold and more like someone responding to a pull he doesn't understand. Buggy doesn't know why the treasure matters. He just knows that it does. That kind of intuition doesn't come from ambition. It comes from proximity. Buggy was there, on Roger's ship, close enough to history to feel its gravity, even if he never grasped its meaning. And that's why his fixation isn't random. It's residual awareness, the echo of a symbol he once brushed against and never truly forgot. That echo becomes harder to ignore when you look at how Buggy is visually framed in modern One Piece. The crown imagery tied to him, especially in promotional material like the TCG, feels almost uncomfortable. Oversized, ironic, too deliberate to be accidental. Buggy wearing a crown isn't meant to convince you he's a king. It's meant to unsettle you, because crowns in One Piece aren't fashion accessories. They're narrative signals. When Oda draws a crown, it's never neutral. And placing that symbol on Buggy, the least qualified ruler imaginable, forces a question the story refuses to answer directly. Why does the world keep crowning the wrong man? Buggy doesn't earn loyalty, it accumulates around him. He doesn't build empires, they form behind him by accident. The Cross Guild doesn't exist because Buggy planned it. It exists because power keeps misidentifying him as something he isn't, and that misidentification mirrors the world government's greatest mistake, just as they chased the wrong king for decades. The world keeps projecting authority onto Buggy, confusing proximity to the crown with ownership of it. This is where Buggy's role becomes disturbingly clear. He isn't a king, he's a placeholder, a living decoy, someone the world elevates precisely because he doesn't understand the power he appears to hold. And that makes him safe. Buggy will never intentionally activate the symbol of pirate sovereignty because he doesn't believe in it. He wants recognition, not responsibility. Status, not meaning. That's why the crown can sit on his head without consequence. It's inert in his presence. Decorative. Hollow. Buggy represents what happens when authority is divorced from will. A crown without substance. A king without gravity. And yet, the world rallies behind him anyway, proving how desperate people are for symbols, even false ones. In that sense, Buggy isn't a failure of piracy. He's a mirror held up to it, showing how easily power can be misplaced when no one remembers what it was meant to stand for in the first place. but Buggy's accidental kingship only exists because of what came before him. Because someone else ended God Valley. Someone who didn't wear a crown, didn't claim sovereignty, and didn't misunderstand the weight of symbols. Garp didn't become a placeholder. He became an anchor. While Buggy floats upward on misinterpretation, Garp stands immovable, refusing elevation even when the world begs him to accept it. That contrast isn't a coincidence. It's design. The fake king rises because the real one refuses to sit. And the true mystery of One Piece doesn't lie with the clown wearing a crown he doesn't understand. It lies with the man who ended an era, rejected its rewards, and walked away from the throne the world tried to give him. There's a detail about Garp that feels almost wrong once you notice it, because it doesn't behave the way injuries are supposed to behave in One Piece. His scars don't stay put. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're gone, sometimes they appear more pronounced, and other times they vanish entirely as if they were never meant to be permanent. In a story where scars are treated as narrative anchors, visual proof of battles survived and wills tested, this inconsistency stands out. Whitebeard's scars never fade. Zoro's are practically sacred. Even Luffy's marks remain fixed reminders of pain and growth. But Garp's scars don't obey those rules. They fluctuate. They contradict themselves. And that shouldn't happen unless the story is trying to say something without saying it out loud. This isn't a simple continuity error. Oda is meticulous when it comes to scars, especially on legendary figures, which means Garp's shifting wounds are less about damage and more about identity. Something about him isn't stable, or more accurately, something about him exists in more than one state at once. What makes this even more unsettling is how isolated this trait is. Among Marines, no one else displays this kind of visual inconsistency. Admirals age visibly. Vice admirals accumulate damage. Veterans wear their battles like medals, except for one glaring outlier, and he isn't even a Marine. Mihawk. The world's greatest swordsman shares the same strange relationship with permanence. His scars, too, are rare, ambiguous, and selectively revealed. Both men exist outside the usual systems of validation. Garp rejects promotion. Mihawk rejects allegiance. One refuses to become an admiral. The other refuses to rule anything at all, and both are framed visually as men who have fought monsters, yet remain strangely untouched by time's usual markers. This parallel isn't superficial, it's thematic. These are men who stand at the edges of identity, inside the system, yet not bound by it. Their scars don't tell a linear story because their lives don't follow one. They exist in tension between what they are and what they refuse to become. That tension is the core of Garp's duality. He is simultaneously the hero of the Marines and their greatest contradiction. A man celebrated for defending the world government while openly despising its core values. A warrior who ended God Valley yet rejected every reward that followed. a grandfather who raised the future enemy of the state while serving it faithfully. His scars appearing and disappearing mirror that contradiction perfectly. They reflect a man split between roles, between truths, between histories. One version of Garp is the obedient Marine, scarred by duty. Another is the free man who laughs at authority, untouched by its rules. The story never tells us which one is real, because both are. And that duality might not be symbolic alone. It might be literal. The idea that Garp shares will, identity, or even narrative space with someone else, someone erased from history, suddenly feels less absurd when his body itself refuses to settle into a single version of events. And then there's his laugh. Because if scars tell you what a man has survived, his laugh tells you who he truly is. Garp's laughter doesn't stay consistent either. Sometimes it's loud, careless, and infectious. Other times it's sharp, unsettling, almost cruel. Two laughs, two rhythms, two emotional signatures coming from the same man. In One Piece, laughter is identity. Every major character has a unique laugh that defines them more clearly than any title. So when one man has more than one, it's not a quirk. It's a warning. Garp's scars may appear and disappear, but his laugh betrays something deeper. A fracture not just in how he's seen, but in who he might actually be. In One Piece, a character's laugh isn't just personality, it's identity made audible. It's the clearest signal of how someone exists in the world. That's why Garp's laughter is so unsettling once you really listen to it. He doesn't have one laugh. He has multiple. At times it's booming, reckless, almost childlike. The sound of a man who refuses to take authority seriously. Other times it's sharp, restrained, edged with something darker, like a man who knows exactly how violent the world can be and finds no humor in pretending otherwise. These aren't mood swings. They're distinct expressions. Most characters in One Piece grow louder or quieter depending on emotion, but their laugh stays consistent. Garp's doesn't. It switches. And in a story where laughs are as deliberate as devil fruits, that inconsistency is impossible to ignore. It suggests that Garp isn't just reacting differently. He's accessing different sides of himself depending on the moment. As if two truths are occupying the same body. That idea becomes far more disturbing when you compare Garp's demeanor to what little we know about Rox D. Zebek. Rox is described as chaotic, loud, uncontrollable, yet magnetic. A man whose presence fractured alliances and pulled monsters into his orbit without effort. He laughed in the face of the world, rejected hierarchy outright, and sought not to rule it, but to overturn the idea that anyone should. That description overlaps uncomfortably well with one version of Garp. The laughing, reckless, insubordinate Marine who mocks authority, refuses promotion, and openly insults the celestial dragons. Yet the other version of Garp, the disciplined, duty-bound warrior who stands firm against chaos. feels like the inverse reflection. Order versus disruption. Law versus freedom. Two expressions of the same core will split across opposing roles. If rocks represented unrestrained defiance, Garp represents defiance chained just tightly enough to prevent collapse. And that mirroring doesn't feel accidental. It feels engineered, as if the story is showing us two outcomes of the same foundational spirit. This opens the door to a dangerous possibility, that Garp and Rocks weren't just rivals, but counterparts. Not copies, not reincarnations in the simple sense, but parallel manifestations of the same will respond to different circumstances. One chose to attack the system head-on, the other chose to stand inside it and rot it from within. That would explain why Garp was the only Marine capable of stopping Rocks, not because he was stronger, but because he understood him. You can't truly defeat something you don't recognize. Garp didn't fight Rocks like an enemy. He fought him like a mirror. And mirrors are terrifying because they show you what you could become. If Rocks was erased from history, then Garp's continued existence becomes even more suspicious. It's as if the world allowed one version of that will to survive because it could be controlled, while destroying the version that refused compromise. That split would also explain Garp's internal conflict, his shifting scars, his dual laughter. A man forced to live with the weight of a path he didn't choose, haunted by the one that was erased instead. And this is where the story begins to turn cold. Because when dual wills exist in one piece, they don't stay theoretical for long. They manifest physically. They leave scars on the body and the world alike. And when ice enters the picture, history doesn't just pause, it's preserved. Kuzan freezing Garp isn't just a betrayal or a dramatic moment. It's a symbolic suspension, a man placed on hold, neither alive nor dead, neither active nor erased. The same fate rumored to have befallen Rocks himself. Ice doesn't destroy, it stops. And when the same solution appears twice in history, it's no longer a coincidence. It's a pattern. History insists that Rocks D. Zebek died at God Valley, but One Piece has never treated death as something that simple. When characters truly die, the story marks it clearly. Graves matter. Final words linger. Wills are passed on. But with Zebek, there is only absence. No body, no confirmed end, just erasure. His name scrubbed, his island was removed, his existence is reduced to whispers, and in a world where even ancient monsters leave scars behind, that kind of silence is unnatural. That silence feels intentional, which is why the theory that Zebek wasn't killed, but frozen, begins to make terrifying sense. Haosu, the frozen land tied to ancient secrets and suspended time, mirrors the kind of fate reserved not for enemies, but for threats that cannot be allowed to conclude. Freezing isn't mercy, it's containment, a way to stop history from moving forward without acknowledging it ever existed. Zebek wasn't defeated in battle. He was paused. That interpretation aligns perfectly with what we later see happen to Garp. Kuzan's ice doesn't shatter him. It doesn't mutilate him. It preserves him in a state that feels eerily ceremonial. A hero frozen mid-stance, laughter silenced, story interrupted. Kuzan doesn't execute Garp the way the world government would want. He suspends him, just as history appears to have done with Xebec. This parallel isn't subtle, it's deliberate. Ice in One Piece represents control over time and consequence. What fire destroys, ice preserves. What fear erases, ice archives. And when two of the most dangerous figures tied to God Valley end up frozen rather than killed, the implication becomes unavoidable. These men weren't meant to die. They were meant to be removed without closure, locked away in a state where their will couldn't spread, but their existence couldn't be denied internally either. That symbolic suspension carries enormous weight. Death creates martyrs. Execution sparks rebellion. But freezing creates uncertainty. It traps the truth in limbo. The world never gets answers. Stories can be rewritten while the original remains inaccessible. That's exactly what happened after God Valley. Xebec disappears and Garp is crowned a hero. One narrative replaces another. Order replaces chaos. But beneath that order lies something unresolved. A will that hasn't been extinguished, only stalled. And this reframes Kuzan's role entirely. He isn't acting as an executioner. He's acting as a warden. Someone who understands that killing certain figures would only accelerate the collapse of the system. Better to preserve them. Better to keep them frozen in time until the world is either ready to face them or strong enough to survive their return. And once you understand freezing as preservation instead of punishment, another character's tragedy suddenly shifts into focus. Kuma. Because Kuma isn't dead. He isn't alive either. He exists in a state of functional suspension, stripped of will, locked into obedience, preserved as a body without agency, just like Xebec, just like Garp. Kuma wasn't destroyed. He was paused, which redefines everything about who he really is and why the world government went to such lengths to control him. Kuma was never free, not in the way One Piece defines freedom. Even before his body was hollowed out, even before his voice disappeared, his existence was already constrained by something invisible and absolute. What we call Kuma the Tyrant, Kuma the Warlord, Kuma the Pacifista prototype. None of those identities describe a man making choices. They describe a vessel executing instructions. His silence wasn't humility. It was absence. A shell moving through the world with purpose that didn't originate from within. In a story where freedom is the ultimate currency, Kuma stands out not because he lacks power, but because his power never feels like his own. Every action he takes follows a line. No hesitation, no deviation, no emotional residue. And that pattern becomes chilling once you stop asking what Kuma did and start asking why he never did anything else. The pawpaw fruit is often treated as whimsical, almost cartoonish, but its mechanics are brutally precise. It doesn't scatter. It doesn't explode. It sends things in perfectly straight trajectories, calculated and absolute. There is no curve, no choice mid-flight. Once the direction is set, the outcome is inevitable. That isn't just a combat ability. It's a philosophy encoded into a devil fruit. Kuma doesn't push people away randomly. He sends them exactly where they are meant to go. And when you re-watch his most famous actions, the Straw Hats being separated, objects being repelled across the globe, Kuma himself launching his body toward the red line, you realize none of it looks like improvisation. It looks like execution. The red line crash wasn't a sacrifice born of will. It was a forced command reaching its final destination. Kuma didn't choose to go there. He was sent. That changes the emotional weight of everything surrounding him. His supposed acts of kindness, saving the Straw Hats, protecting the Sunny, enduring humiliation, aren't proof of freedom. They're proof of preloaded instructions running to completion. Kuma is a program built to preserve certain outcomes while erasing himself in the process. And that's why his death never lands like death, because death implies an ending. Kuma's story doesn't end. It loops. A body that continues moving without a self, obeying commands long after the man who once lived there was silenced. This isn't punishment. It's utilization. Kuma wasn't frozen in ice like Zebek or Garp. He was frozen in function. A living suspension that removes unpredictability entirely. And the Seraphim confirm this wasn't an accident or a tragedy born of desperation. They are proof of concept. Controlled bodies, replicated bloodlines. Obedience hard-coded beneath overwhelming power. The world government didn't lose Kuma and scramble to adapt. They perfected him. They took what worked, his obedience, his silence, his straight-line existence, and mass-produced it. Kuma wasn't a failure. He was a prototype, which means everything done to him was intentional from the start. And once you accept that, the question stops being what the world government did to Kuma, and becomes who they're planning to do it to next. The Seraphim didn't just introduce stronger weapons. They revealed a philosophy of control the world government had been refining for centuries. Their command hierarchy isn't about loyalty or trust. It's about absolute authority encoded into flesh. Orders don't persuade them. They overwrite them. The highest voice speaks, and the body obeys, regardless of context, morality, or consequence. This isn't obedience learned through fear or indoctrination. It's obedience designed at the foundational level of existence. And once you understand that, the Seraphim stop feeling like soldiers and start feeling like locks, fail-safes built to ensure power never slips out of approved hands. Authority chips aren't tools of convenience. They're insurance policies against free will itself. That system forces us to reevaluate Kuma's transformation from a different angle. Kuma wasn't turned into a pacifista because the technology existed. The technology exists because Kuma proved the concept could work. Long before Seraphim command chains were openly acknowledged, Kuma was already responding to voices above his own. His body accepted instructions he could not refuse. His will was slowly deprioritized until it became irrelevant. The blankness in his eyes wasn't a side effect. It was the objective, a visual confirmation that the self had been successfully removed. Kuma wasn't malfunctioning. He was functioning perfectly, exactly as a prototype would. Which means Vegapunk didn't invent the Seraphim system and then apply it to Kuma. He applied an existing ideology to Kuma and refined it. Blank eyes recur throughout One Piece for a reason. They appear in slaves, in controlled soldiers, in those stripped of agency. It's the absence of reflection. No spark. No hesitation. A body that receives reality but does not interpret it. Kuma's eyes are the most haunting example because we know there was once kindness behind them. Love, belief, conviction. Watching that disappear isn't just tragic. It's instructional. It shows what happens when authority is allowed to replace identity. And that symbolism reaches backward in time. The world government didn't suddenly decide to erase will with technology. They've been doing it culturally, politically, and historically since the Void Century. Vegapunk didn't create obedience. He mechanized it, which leads to the most unsettling realization of all. Vegapunk wasn't working alone, and he never was. The ideas behind authority chips, command hierarchies, and silent soldiers predate him. He inherited them, improved them, rationalized them. But the blueprint, the belief that certain wills are too dangerous to exist freely, belongs to something far older. The same force that erased Zebek instead of killing him. The same force that froze threats instead of martyring them. The same force that doesn't destroy rebellion, but archives it. Vegapunk is a scientist. Scientists don't decide what is forbidden. They're told. Power in One Piece has never been clean. It stains. It mutates. It leaves residue behind that the world pretends not to see. The lineage factor, often explained as a scientific breakthrough, is less a discovery and more an exposure, an uncovering of something already unstable beneath the surface of life itself. When Vegapunk manipulates it, he isn't creating power from nothing. He's accelerating decay. Green blood flowing through the Seraphim isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's visual proof that their strength comes from contamination, something foreign replacing something natural. Lineage factor manipulation isn't evolution. It's pollution, disguised as progress. And the more potent the result, the further it drifts from anything resembling humanity. That contamination has a clear parallel in SAD, the substance used to manufacture artificial devil fruits. SAD is never portrayed as neutral. It poisons land, warps bodies, creates unstable power at the cost of long-term ruin. Entire ecosystems collapse around it. The fruits it produces grant abilities, but strip away something intangible in return. Emotion dulls. Humanity fractures. Just like green blood, SAD trades permanence for immediacy. Power now, consequences later. And that parallel matters because it suggests a single underlying principle governing artificial strength in this world. Borrowed power always exacts interest. No exception. The world government knows this. They've always known. That's why they isolate these projects. Why do they hide them on distant islands? Why do the people closest to the work never leave unchanged? The pattern becomes undeniable when you look at who benefits from this decay. Not the users, not the soldiers, not the islands sacrificed to experimentation. The beneficiaries are always distant, insulated, untouched. Power flows upward. Decay pools downward. This is the same structure used by the celestial dragons themselves, extracting life, labor, and suffering while remaining physically pure. Green blood becomes a symbol of that hierarchy. The lower you are in the chain, the more corrupted your body becomes to sustain the system. The higher you are, the more pristine you remain. Power in one piece isn't about strength. It's about who absorbs the cost. And this is where the story quietly gestures toward something ancient. Because long before green blood, before SAD, before the lineage factor was named, there were techniques that achieved power without mutation, without pollution, without visible decay. Techniques that relied not on altering the body, but on aligning the will. They didn't leave residue. They didn't poison blood. And they terrified the world government far more than any artificial weapon ever could. Which is why they were forgotten, or more accurately, buried. Life return is one of the most misunderstood techniques in One Piece, because it doesn't look like power. It doesn't explode cities. It doesn't fracture the sky. It doesn't announce itself with spectacle. Instead, it rewrites the relationship between body and will so completely that the two become indistinguishable. At its core, life return is the ability to consciously control every biological function: heartbeat, digestion, muscle tension, even fat storage, through intention alone. Energy isn't generated externally, it's redistributed internally. The body becomes a closed system, obeying thought as law. That's why it feels unsettling when you understand it properly. Devil fruits grant power by introducing something foreign. Haki amplifies presence through spiritual pressure. Life return bypasses both. It turns the body itself into an instrument of will. That conversion chain, energy into will into matter, is what makes life return so dangerous. It implies that the physical world can be altered without mutation, without borrowed power, and without decay. Rob Lucci doesn't bulk up through transformation. He reallocates mass. He doesn't lose fat. He commands it to move. His control is surgical, absolute, and terrifyingly efficient. Chopper's mastery of medical knowledge combined with Monster Point isn't just a Zoan quirk. It's proto-life return, brute-forcing bodily authority through drugs instead of discipline. Don Chinjiao's shattered head wasn't healed by medicine or fruit power, but by reclaiming command over his own structure. He didn't repair himself. He remembered how to exist correctly. Each of these examples points to the same truth. The body already knows how to change. Life return is the permission slip. What separates life return from artificial power systems is cost. There is none, at least not externally. The price is internal mastery, discipline, awareness. Control is so absolute that instinct becomes unnecessary. That's why it's rare. That's why it's never institutionalized. You can't mass-produce life return. You can't install it with green blood or command it with authority chips. It can't be stolen, replicated, or enforced. It has to be chosen. And that makes it incompatible with the world government's philosophy. They don't fear strength. They fear autonomy. A person who masters life return doesn't need permission to change. They don't need tools. They don't need approval. Their body becomes sovereign territory. And that brings us to the most dangerous implication of all. Life return isn't new. It's ancient. Its principles align perfectly with a time before artificial augmentation, before polluted bloodlines, before power came with decay. Now imagine someone who mastered it centuries ago. Someone whose will was so refined that their body could adapt endlessly without corruption. Someone who didn't need devil fruits because reality already obeyed them. That isn't a warrior. That's a civilization-ending variable. And if such a person existed during the Void Century, the world government's obsession with erasing history suddenly becomes terrifyingly logical. Imu doesn't rule the world with firepower, and that's the first mistake everyone makes when trying to understand them. The ancient weapon that erased an island wasn't Imu's true weapon. It was a demonstration, a warning. A punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had already been written centuries ago. Imu's real power is quieter, more intimate, and far more terrifying, the ability to sustain authority itself. The Gorosei are the clearest proof. 5 men who have stood at the top of the world for generations without aging in any meaningful way, without showing the physical decline that should come with time, battle, or stress. Their scars don't linger. Their bodies don't weaken. Their presence doesn't fade. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't technology alone. This is maintenance. Imu doesn't command the Gorosei like soldiers. Imu maintains them like extensions of a system, feeding something into them that keeps their bodies aligned with their role. Not youth, not immortality. Purpose. The moment you realize the Gorosei aren't surviving time but being sustained through it, the structure of power in one piece shifts completely. Longevity in One Piece has always come at a cost. Devil fruits warp the body. Artificial enhancements rot it. Even extreme Haki usage visibly drains its users over time. But the Gorosei show none of this. Their longevity isn't the result of resisting decay. It's the result of controlling energy flow so precisely that decay never begins. This is life return taken to its logical extreme, externalized and weaponized. Imu doesn't just control their own body. They regulate others by anchoring them to a shared system of energy and will. Think of it less like healing and more like calibration. The Gorosei don't live long lives because they're strong. They live long lives because they're aligned. As long as their fear, loyalty, and identity remain fixed, the energy sustaining them continues to circulate. Break that alignment, and the system collapses. This is why the world government doesn't simply execute traitors at the top. They erase them. Memory, fear, and obedience are the real currencies here. Bodies are secondary, and this is where fear enters the equation, not as an emotion, but as a mechanism. Fear in One Piece has always had a strange relationship with power. It doesn't just affect morale, it disrupts abilities at a fundamental level. Big Mom loses control the moment terror overwhelms her senses. Sugar's abilities collapse and the instant fear breaks her concentration. Kumadori explicitly links life return to emotional regulation, stating that panic interrupts bodily command. Fear destabilizes will, and will is the fuel that powers everything, from devil fruits to Haki to life return itself. Imu understands this better than anyone. Fear isn't a byproduct of their rule. It's the activation condition. The Gorosei remain sustained because they fear Imu absolutely, not in a screaming, shaking way, but in a quiet, existential way that locks their will into submission. As long as that fear exists, their bodies remain obedient. As long as their bodies remain obedient, time cannot claim them. This reframes the entire conflict of One Piece. The final enemy isn't a tyrant with overwhelming strength. It's a system that weaponizes fear to disable freedom at the biological level. Fear has always broken devil fruits because devil fruits are expressions of desire, imagination, and will. When fear dominates, desire collapses, imagination shrinks, will fractures. Imu doesn't need to fight Luffy directly to win. They just need to make the world afraid enough that freedom stops functioning. That's why ancient weapons are used sparingly. That's why history is erased instead of rewritten. That's why symbols, crowns, thrones, empty chairs matter more than armies. Imu's true weapon isn't a gun, a beam, or a blade. It's fear calibrated so precisely that it rewrites reality itself. And the moment fear stops working, the entire structure holding the world together begins to fail. Fear has never been treated as a power system in One Piece, but it behaves like one. It doesn't grant abilities. It doesn't create spectacle. Instead, it quietly dismantles whatever power already exists. Over and over again, the story shows devil fruits failing, not because someone was outmatched, but because their will collapsed at the wrong moment. Big Mom isn't defeated by raw strength when she spirals. She's neutralized by emotional shock. Her hunger pangs don't just distract her. They fracture the mental cohesion that allows her absurd power to function. Sugar's god-tier ability doesn't fade due to exhaustion or injury. It vanishes, and the instant terror breaks her focus. Kumadori, the very character who introduces life return, explicitly states that emotional disturbance disrupts bodily control. These aren't coincidences scattered across the narrative. They're rules. Fear doesn't overpower devil fruits. It turns them off by severing the connection between intention and execution. Devil fruits are often described as manifestations of desire, dreams given form. That makes them fundamentally incompatible with fear. Desire reaches outward. Fear collapses inward. When someone is afraid, their attention narrows, their body prioritizes survival, and their imagination shuts down. That's why fear doesn't just weaken powers. It rewrites the conditions that allow those powers to exist. Big Mom's homies don't disobey her because they grow stronger. They fail because she loses the emotional stability required to command them. Sugar's touch stops working not because her fruit is fragile, but because her mind can no longer sustain the belief that she is in control. Kumadori's life. Return teachings reinforce this idea perfectly. Mastery of the body requires emotional equilibrium. Panic equals loss of authority. Fear equals surrender of sovereignty over oneself. Once you see fear as a counter rather than an emotion, Imu's rule becomes disturbingly logical. Imu doesn't dominate through constant violence. They dominate through omnipresent dread. The world government's greatest weapon isn't the Marines, the Buster Call, or even the ancient weapons. It's uncertainty. Erased history. Forbidden questions. Invisible lines no one is allowed to cross. Fear doesn't need to be extreme to be effective. It just needs to be constant. That's why entire nations submit without seeing a single celestial dragon. That's why even powerful figures hesitate to challenge the system directly. If Imu's power truly depends on fear to function, if their ability to sustain control, longevity, or even reality itself requires widespread submission, then their greatest vulnerability isn't rebellion. It's courage. Not loud defiance, but quiet refusal to be afraid. And that's exactly where Garp enters the story as a contradiction the system never solved. Garp refused to live in fear. Not of pirates, not of the world government, not even of history itself. He stayed within the Marines, climbed to the highest level, and still rejected the throne he was meant to serve. He laughed in front of the celestial dragons. He disobeyed orders without flinching. He raised the son of the world's most wanted man and the grandson destined to shatter the system. Garp's strength was never just physical, it was psychological immunity. Fear didn't break his will, and because of that, it couldn't break his power. And in a world where fear disables gods, a man who refuses to be afraid becomes something far more dangerous than a revolutionary. he becomes proof that the system can be resisted. Kuzan freezing Garp looks like betrayal only if you believe loyalty in One Piece is simple. But it never has been. From the moment Kuzan was introduced, his justice was defined not by obedience, but by hesitation. Lazy justice wasn't laziness. It was restraint. It was the refusal to act without understanding the cost. That philosophy didn't come from nowhere. It mirrors Garp's worldview almost perfectly. Garp trained Marines to be strong enough to disobey when necessary. He never wanted soldiers. He wanted people who could think. Kuzan wasn't just Garp's student in rank. He was his ideological heir. And when Kuzan froze Garp, it wasn't an act of rebellion against his mentor. It was an act shaped by everything his mentor had taught him. Sometimes, the only way to protect someone inside a broken system is to remove them from it without killing them. The Ohara incident is the blueprint for understanding Kuzan's actions. He was present when the world government erased a nation for knowledge. He saw what absolute obedience produced, and crucially, he didn't fully comply. He let Robin escape, not out of sentimentality, but because he recognized that knowledge itself wasn't the crime. That moment defined Kuzan's relationship with justice. He would never again be the one to pull the trigger just because the system demanded it. When he later betrays the Marines and aligns himself with Blackbeard, the pattern repeats. He doesn't defect for power, he infiltrates. He positions himself where the truth is most dangerous and most hidden. Freezing Garp fits this pattern perfectly. A frozen man isn't dead. A frozen symbol isn't erased. It's preserved, suspended, removed from immediate execution while buying time. That's where the so-called Snape loyalty theory stops being a joke comparison and starts making uncomfortable sense. Kuzan plays the role of traitor because someone has to. Someone has to stay close to monsters without becoming one. Someone has to make choices that look unforgivable on the surface to prevent something far worse beneath it. Garp understood this. That's why he didn't resist. That's why there was no final speech, no dramatic refusal. Garp knew exactly what Kuzan was doing the moment the ice closed in. Fear wasn't present. Trust was. In a world where fear disables power, that trust is what allowed the act to happen without breaking either of them. And this leads to the most unsettling implication of all. The Marines were never meant to survive. Not as they are. The institution isn't broken. It's obsolete. It was designed to maintain fear, not justice. Garp knew this. Kuzan knows this. That's why their actions don't aim to save the Marines. They aim to outlast them. Freezing Garp isn't about preserving a man. It's about preserving an idea until the system that can't tolerate it collapses. Because when fear stops working, when courage spreads faster than obedience, the Marines won't be reformed. They'll be replaced. Sword isn't a faction, it's a confession. The existence of a covert Marine group that operates outside official command is proof that the system failed long before the story began. You don't create Sword unless obedience has become a liability. You don't tolerate it unless fear has stopped working. And while the organization's name is spoken in whispers, its ideology is unmistakably loud. Justice without permission. That philosophy didn't appear overnight, and it didn't originate with some secret council in Mary Jawaz. It traces back to one man who spent his entire career refusing promotions, laughing in front of gods, and raising future enemies of the state. Garp never founded Sword on paper, but he authored its mindset. Every Marine who learned from him absorbed the same lesson. Strength exists to protect people, not institutions. When the institution becomes the threat, loyalty must end. That's why Smoker and Kuzan fit so perfectly as successors, even though they couldn't be more different on the surface. Smoker's justice is blunt, visible, and stubborn. He confronts corruption head-on, even when it costs him rank, respect, or allies. He doesn't play games, and he doesn't pretend the system works. Kuzan, on the other hand, operates in shadows. He understands that some truths can't be spoken yet, and some enemies can't be challenged directly. But both men share the same core trait. Fear doesn't dictate their decisions. Smoker refuses to be intimidated by authority. Kuzan refuses to be controlled by it. One resists openly, the other infiltrates quietly. Together, they represent the two paths Sword was always meant to take: external pressure and internal collapse. Justice without fear is the single concept the world government cannot survive. Fear is the glue holding everything together. The moment Marines stop being afraid of disobedience, the hierarchy loses meaning. Orders become suggestions. Threats become empty. That's why Sword members are often treated as expendable. They're allowed to exist because the system assumes they'll burn out, die, or betray each other. What the world government doesn't realize is that Sword isn't trying to overthrow anything directly. It's waiting for the moment fear stops functioning as a control mechanism. Waiting for symbols like Garp to fall, not as martyrs, but as proof that survival doesn't require submission. When that moment comes, Sword won't announce itself. It won't march. It will simply refuse to disappear. And that refusal ties directly into how the world itself was built. The structure of the One Piece world mirrors its political systems: artificial boundaries, enforced routes, and manufactured hostility. The Marines patrol seas that were designed to be controlled. They protect lines drawn by ancient violence. Sword's emergence signals more than institutional decay. It signals geological truth resurfacing. The world wasn't meant to be divided this way, just as justice wasn't meant to be administered through fear. The collapse of the Old Navy isn't just a political shift, it's a prelude. Because once fear loses its grip on people, it also loses its grip on the world. And when that happens, the land, the seas, and the history buried beneath them begin to move again. The most important lie in One Piece isn't about treasure, pirates, or even the Void Century. It's the lie that the world has always looked like this: scattered islands, hostile seas, impossible navigation, eternal separation. Everything about the planet's geography trains people to accept division as natural. But when you step back and look at the structure of the world as a whole, a different picture starts to emerge, one that feels less accidental and far more deliberate. The Grand Line doesn't behave like a normal ocean. The Red Line doesn't behave like a natural continent. Magnetic fields don't shift randomly in clean loops around the planet. These aren't quirks of fantasy geography. They're scars. The Pangaea supercontinent theory argues that the One Piece world was once a single unified landmass, much like Earth's ancient Pangaea, before being violently fractured. And if that's true, then the greatest crime of the ancient era wasn't the rise of pirates. It was the destruction of unity itself. In this unified world, power wouldn't have been enforced through separation. It would have been shared through balance. That's where the monkey and dragon clans enter the theory, not as literal families in the modern sense, but as symbolic lineages representing opposing halves of the same world. The monkey clan is associated with instinct, freedom, and raw will. The dragon clan is associated with order, guardianship, and responsibility. East and west, sun and wind, impulse and restraint. Peace didn't come from domination, but from union, two forces holding the world together by acknowledging each other's necessity. This isn't a fairy tale version of harmony. It's a functional one. When land is connected, people move freely. Cultures mix. Fear has nowhere to fester. There are no outer seas to exile the unwanted, no unreachable heavens for gods to hide in. The idea of a pirate king ruling divided oceans wouldn't even make sense in such a world because the sea itself wouldn't be a weapon. This reframes ancient peace not as an absence of conflict, but as the absence of enforced isolation. The all-blue isn't a dream, it's a memory. Fish from every sea once shared the same waters because those seas weren't artificially separated. Sky Islands weren't miracles. They were consequences of land displaced upward by forces beyond nature. Reverse Mountain isn't a wonder. It's a wound, forcing the world's currents to obey a design that benefits control over travel. Every bizarre geographic feature starts to align once you assume the planet was intentionally broken. The Pangaea theory doesn't suggest chaos caused the world's shape. It suggests order did. A new order. One that required borders so extreme that even the planet itself had to be rewritten. And that rewriting only makes sense if a weapon was involved. Not a conventional one. Not something that kills armies or cities. Something that reshapes continents. A strike so powerful it didn't just split land. It realigned magnetism, weather, and history. Uranus isn't just an ancient weapon of destruction. It's a planetary tool. The moment it was used, the world stopped being one. The red line rose. The seas separated. The new world became a dumping ground for danger, while the four blues became controlled environments. Peace through union was replaced by stability through fear, and once the planet itself was divided, the people followed. Nations, bloodlines, history, everything fractured. Which means the final war won't just decide who rules the world, It will decide whether the world is allowed to be whole again. The Grand Line isn't just a challenging stretch of ocean. Viewed through the lens of ancient events, it reads less like geography and more like a scar, a reminder of violence so profound it rewrote the planet itself. Long before any pirate plundered its waters, before Roger charted its mysteries, the Grand Line existed as the fracture line of a world once whole. Uranus, the legendary ancient weapon, is widely theorized to have been responsible. But this wasn't about destruction in the sense we usually imagine. It wasn't a fire or explosion. Uranus didn't just destroy buildings or armies. It shattered tectonic stability. Mountains rose where seas should have been. Magnetic currents twisted into impossible loops. Weather patterns became unpredictable to the point of survival requiring mastery. The world itself became an instrument of deterrence, a cage enforcing separation and fear. What humans see as the Grand Line's difficulty is, in reality, the after effect of planetary trauma. A scar that still bleeds instability into every map and compass. The Red Line, the vertical barrier splitting the planet, is another consequence of that catastrophic strike. Legends and fan theories often treat it as a natural continent, a mere feature of the planet's ecosystem. But it's far more than that. The Red Line is a wound, solidified tectonic chaos frozen in place, rising high enough to divide oceans, disrupt climates, and create artificial borders for civilizations. Its creation wasn't an accident or a slow drift of land masses. It was a deliberate separation, a consequence of an unimaginable force applied to an already delicate planetary system. This explains why the Red Line is such an obstacle. It isn't just rock. It's a manifestation of the world's trauma, a permanent reminder of power wielded at the planetary scale. And every island, every ocean current, every route in the Grand Line exists in response to this division. Pirates don't traverse it merely for adventure. They navigate the echoes of an ancient war etched into the planet itself. Sky islands and the magnetic anomalies that allow them to float are further evidence that the world was rewritten, not merely shaped. The energy sustaining these airborne lands is unlike natural buoyancy. It is the residue of magnetism destabilized on a massive scale. The original planetary strike didn't stop at the surface. It reached into the core, shifting magnetic fields, changing gravitational equilibrium, and creating zones where land and sea operate according to different rules. That's why sky islands are so rare and unpredictable, and why the currents around the Red Line behave almost sentiently, defying standard navigation. Every feature is a symptom of the world's fracture, and every oddity, the floating islands, reverse mountains, turbulent currents, is a reminder that the planet we see is artificial, sculpted by weaponized forces and controlled by rules designed for separation. Humanity is forced to adapt not to nature, but to a world already shaped by catastrophic intent. And the most unsettling part? This fracture may not be permanent. Every hint of the One Piece narrative, from the mysterious treasure to the powers of the ancient weapons, points toward a possible planetary reset. The final war, the true purpose of Uranus, and the collection of Pluton and Poseidon may not be about domination. They may be about repair. If the weaponry that shattered the planet can also realign it, then the Grand Line's scars, the Red Line's barrier, and the chaotic magnetic zones aren't just relics. They are temporary. The world as it exists now is a suspension of what could be restored. And if that restoration comes, it won't just reshape land and sea. It will erase centuries of fear, division, and control. The world may finally return to its original form, one supercontinent, unified seas, and a planet free to follow its natural rhythm once more. The question isn't just who will survive this reset, it's whether the world itself will survive intact when it finally wakes. The pirate crown jewel has never been about gold, jewels, or material wealth. That's a misconception that runs through generations of pirates and mariners alike. Every theory, every legend, every whispered rumor in the corners of the New World suggests that the crown is a symbol, a representation of authority, unity, and the right to shape the world, rather than a tangible object that can be held. The crown has passed, in theory, through Roger, Shanks, Buggy, and now Luffy. But each encounter was less about ownership and more about testing readiness. Roger's journey ended not because he failed to claim it, but because the world wasn't prepared for someone to wield the authority it represents. Shanks inherited it briefly, but he too understood its true value lies not in dominance, but in guidance. Buggy's accidental possession underscores this point. A crown alone does nothing without comprehension or will. And now, with Luffy, the story has arrived at someone whose natural leadership, charisma, and moral compass make him capable of embodying what the crown actually signifies. It is not a title, it is a responsibility. Luffy's connection to the crown is not about ruling the seas, claiming thrones, or becoming a king in the conventional sense. It is about being the inheritor of unity, the living proof that the fractured world can be brought back together. Just as the Pangaea supercontinent theory suggests, the world was once whole, and it will only be whole again when someone can inspire cooperation, courage, and freedom without relying on fear. Luffy doesn't need to force submission or conquer islands. His authority arises from the instinctive trust others place in him, the loyalty he inspires, and the willpower that makes allies and enemies alike recognize a greater purpose. The crown is drawn to those who can embody that kind of influence, the kind that aligns people not through coercion, but through shared destiny. In this sense, Luffy is not a king. He is a beacon, a convergence point for the world's disparate wills, energies, and histories. He symbolizes the possibility of reconciliation for a planet long divided by weapons, fear, and political manipulation. The ultimate manifestation of this unity may be the legendary all-blue, long sought by chefs and dreamers alike. More than a mythical sea where all fish coexist, all blue represents restoration on every level: ecological, geographical, and symbolic. It is the world remade whole, the oceans connected again, the fractures healed, and the old lines of fear erased. The crown, in the hands of someone like Luffy, would not merely mark him as a ruler, but act as a key to restoring balance to the planet itself. Islands that were separated by cataclysmic weapons could once again be part of a greater whole. Currents and skies that defy natural law could realign. Every disrupted system, from marine forces to ancient powers, would find its place within a renewed world order. The all-blue is thus the tangible proof of what the crown represents. Not domination, but repair. It is the fulfillment of centuries of struggle, fear, and ambition, culminating in the possibility of a planet no longer fractured by its past. And yet, the timing of this restoration cannot be forced. The crown will not return until the world is ready, until the seas, the people, and the powers of the planet are aligned in a way that can sustain unity rather than destroy it. Luffy's journey, fraught with struggle, betrayal, and discovery, is as much about preparing the world as it is about claiming the crown. Every enemy he defeats, every alliance he forges, and every symbol he preserves contributes to the readiness of the planet itself. And in that sense, the story of One Piece becomes a story not about conquest, but about awakening, a slow, deliberate preparation for a world capable of embracing a new order. Which raises the ultimate question. When the crown finally returns and the seas are no longer fractured, what will the world look like? Will it be a paradise restored, or a reality that challenges every assumption we have about history, power, and the meaning of freedom? The answer, as always, lies just beyond the horizon, waiting for the one who can guide the world to a place it has never been before. The story of One Piece has always been layered, complex, and seemingly endless, but when you trace the threads of the pirate crown jewel, Garp, Kuma, Emu, and the fractured world, a pattern emerges. These aren't isolated mysteries or character arcs. They are pieces of a puzzle designed to reflect the consequences of a broken world. The crown jewel was never about gold or jewels. It is a symbol of authority and unity, passed down, tested, and hidden through generations of pirates, always waiting for someone capable of carrying the responsibility of repair. Garp embodies the same principle, a figure who refuses to be ruled by fear, whose strength is inseparable from his moral independence, who trains successors to resist coercion rather than obey blindly. Kuma is another reflection of this fractured history, a living, silent testament to the cost of control, a being whose body and will were stolen to enforce the dominance of the world government. And then there is Emu, whose mastery of life return and energy manipulation demonstrates how fear can maintain the illusion of order, preserving authority even when it is inherently unnatural. Each of these characters, powers, and symbols points to the same truth. The world is not merely chaotic, It was broken on purpose, shaped by hands that sought control, and maintained through centuries of fear, manipulation, and deliberate fragmentation. The parallels between these figures reveal a recurring pattern. History is repeating because it was interrupted. The fracturing of the world, the cataclysmic use of ancient weapons like Uranus, the creation of the Red Line, and the emergence of isolated seas all point to a singular interruption in the natural course of the planet. Fear replaced free will, obedience replaced choice, and the natural order was rewritten to favor control over life itself. Garp's defiance, Kuzan's complicated loyalty, and the existence of Sword as a shadowed force within the Marines are all corrective measures, subtle pushes against the broken system. Even the crown jewel, appearing at crucial points in history, acts as both symbol and instrument, testing the world to see who is capable of restoring it. Every generation that encounters it experiences the same challenge: survive fear, navigate corruption, and awaken courage capable of restoring what was lost. History has not failed. It has been paused, and each key player, the pirates, the Marines, and even the manipulated experiments, represents one step along the path of correction, a chance to set the cycle back on course. What emerges from this intricate web is the realization that the One Piece narrative is as much about planetary healing as it is about individual adventure. The Pangaea theory situates the fractured seas, Sky Islands, and Grand Line not as background scenery but as physical manifestations of a world waiting to be mended. Luffy, as the inheritor of the crown, symbolizes the convergence of will, courage, and moral clarity necessary to restore unity. The all-blue represents not just a literal convergence of waters and life, but a metaphorical convergence of history, choice, and freedom. Every battle he fights, every alliance he builds, every ancient secret he uncovers is a step toward a world that can be whole again. The old powers, the ancient weapons, lineage factors, and life-altering techniques serve not only as obstacles or tools, but as markers of what must be understood and mastered to allow healing. In essence, One Piece is a story of restoration. A world broken by fear, greed, and violence, waiting for a generation brave enough to reclaim it. And that brings us to the final, haunting question that threads through every event, every character, and every mystery. If the world was broken once to control it, what happens when it's whole again? When fear no longer dictates the flow of power, when the Red Line no longer isolates nations, when unity replaces manipulation, what will the world do with freedom it has never truly experienced? Will humanity rise, cooperate, and flourish? Or will the sudden collapse of imposed order unleash chaos of a different kind? The crown jewel, the fractured world, the manipulated bodies and wills, the cycles of fear and rebellion, all of it has been leading to this moment. A moment that will decide not only who holds the seas, but whether the planet itself can finally heal. The story doesn't end with a single victory or a final battle. It ends with the question that has echoed since the first fracture: Can a world broken to maintain control survive when it is finally allowed to be whole?